Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and what I want to do today is just talk about the world of microservices. Now, and what it is and why does it matter? Microservices. Now, microservices isn't really a special thing. It's a style of how you architect your application. Okay, so let's kind of go through the history of how web apps were, you know, designed. Okay, so once upon a time, basically your apps were just one big monolithic app. Okay, so you'd have your front end. Okay, let me change the background of that box, something a little bit more visible. Right here. Let's change it to that. Okay, and then you'd have your back end. And they were all attached to each other, so it was just one big app. Because the way it would work is your backend server, let's say using like PHP with, which was literally kind of designed for this kind of thing. It could also be Node with Express and templating languages like EJS. But what would happen is that you would write templates for your website. So basically your website had many pages, what's called a multi-page application. Okay, so then what would happen, and then these pages would all have links to each other, to the different pages on your website. And the websites were done, so using PHP as an example, they'd be PHP files. Okay, let me actually just kind of show you what a PHP file would look like. Do I have a PHP file here right now? I don't. Okay, so let me make one. Okay, oh, nope, not there. Okay, so let's just create a quick PHP file. PHP. Okay, it could look like an HTML file. The only difference is you would create little things like this, like h1 slash h1, and then in here we'd use like little PHP to interject something. So like echo hello world. Okay, and then that needs a semicolon because PHP is annoying like that. Okay. And see, this is a PHP file. Okay, but now if I open this, if I were to go open this up in live server, which it's not gonna let me do right now, here. Well, let's just do this. PHP -s localhost 3000, if I remember right, is the command. Okay, good. It started. So that starts the PHP server. Let me go over to the browser. Localhost 3000 / test.php. Where did it start the server? Let's see. Oh, I started out of the wrong folder. So one moment. CD. Yep. And then let's start that PHP server. Let's try that again. /test. Oops. /test.php. Okay, that didn't quite work the way I wanted it to work. What it should be saying is like saying hello world somewhere or something like that. H1 hello world. Why is it not? I could just do this, but I don't think that's going to matter. Yep, okay, I guess that did matter. Okay, so hello world. But basically the way this worked is essentially there's a PHP server running on my computer right now. So when I requested the website, this PHP server looked at the PHP file and rendered the template. It filled in all those little blanks using PHP code. Okay, and then sent the compiled HTML back to the front end. Okay, so none of that PHP code is actually running in the browser. It's basically running on the server, building out the website, and sending it back. And it only sends back the finishing website. And then when I click onto another page on the website, it sends a new request to the server, which then renders a new template and sends it back. So if you use WordPress, that's what WordPress is doing underneath the hood. Problem with this is when you have your front end and your back end very coupled with each other, like really just like bundled with each other, there's a couple downsides. One, your server is doing a lot more work because not only is it receiving the request and sending a response that includes data, but it's also doing all that work of templating the website. So imagine you're getting millions of requests from your server, and your server is now having to render these templates over and over and over and over again for every request. That can end up getting quite burdensome on your server. Your server's doing extra work, and on top of it, your front end and your back end are just that much more tied together. You can't really separate them because your back end doesn't just return information, and a PHP template is not going to be very helpful on a mobile website or on a desktop application, or if you just need straight text data. Okay, so you'd have to, add more functionality to your server to facilitate all these other things, or create a whole other servers. Okay, so you basically have this situation where, the reusability of your application isn't super useful. So now you have to recreate a whole separate mobile application back and front, whole new desktop application back and front. Not quite as. So we've kind of moved away from that. One, because again, it wasn't the most efficient use of the server resources, and again, that tight coupling. So we separated the front end and the back end. You can still use PHP. Okay, so this is not a knock on PHP. I love PHP. It's a great language. But now what would happen is that your back end is an API. Okay, so instead of it sending rendered templates back, so it doesn't generate any HTML. Instead, it just sends back JSON data. Okay. So basically what's going to happen is your front end is going to be making requests to the server, and it's going to send back JSON data. And then your front end figures it all out as far as how it should look. So it receives the data, and then your front end code, which your back end server has no idea what it is, nor does it care. It just says, here's your data, and the front end code goes, okay, here's how I'm going to take this data, and here's what I'm going to do with it. I'm going to put it on the screen here. I'm going to make a little button over here, and that's where kind of like you use libraries. Well, you could use jQuery, not. Which was the standard once upon a time. So a lot of old websites have jQuery. So if you get a job, in coding, you're very likely not to necessarily be working on the newest website in the world. So very likely you will run into jQuery in coding world. So for any of you people who are learning coding and wondering like, why should I learn jQuery? Because it's still really relevant in the world, especially for like medium to larger companies who built their websites maybe 5-10 years ago. jQuery is probably part of their tech stack. Now, if you're working at some bleeding edge startup that started in the last few years, then you're probably talking about like Vue, Angular, React, Svelte, Stencil.js, these types of technologies to create their front end. Okay. But basically, you would use this framework. When the information arrives from your back end, it's these frameworks that sit there and kind of figure out, okay, how should it look like on the screen? When should it update? All this stuff. So that logic is completely independent of the information. Okay, this is a separate standalone app that's just asking for information and receiving it. Separately, you can then create a separate mobile app. Okay, so here's my mobile app. Let's say, actually, let's do it this way. Control C. Okay, so we'll have a mobile app, and your mobile app might be created like in the Swift programming language. If we're talking about Android, it might be made in not Swift. For iOS, you use Swift. Kotlin, if you're making an Android app. And there's languages that help you do both. Like if you use the Dart programming language with the Flutter compiler, that allows you to do for iOS and Android. Or if you use React Native, that allows you to program for iOS and Android. Or Xamarin, if we're talking about the .NET environment. All these things allow you to create a mobile front-end app. Okay, so the actual mobile app that the user interacts with on their phone, which is essentially just a front-end app. Okay, so now we have this app, and let me start making these front ends smaller. Okay, so now we have my front end web app. So this is my web front end app. Okay. And now both of them can be pulling information from this backend API. Because again, the API really doesn't care what happens in the front end. It just delivers JSON. It just delivers data. When the mobile app receives the data and how it's going to look on the screen, how is it going to work, what buttons are there pushable, the backend doesn't care. The backend just sends the data, and it's going to be through these technologies that people will describe what happens with the data on the user's screen. Vice versa, on the web, it's going to be these technologies that are going to describe what do we do with the data on the user end. And then maybe we also want to have a desktop app. Okay, so let's create a desktop app. Okay, I'm not going to list a bunch of technologies for desktop apps. The only one I will list is for JavaScript. There's Electron. But pretty much every language also has libraries for creating desktop apps. So apps that don't run in the browser, apps that don't run on a mobile phone, they run on specifically desktop computers. But again, this application, because now almost all computers are persistently connected to the internet, these, instead of having all your desktop app as just one big application that's on your computer, nowadays they're really just a web app, in a sense, built as a desktop app. It just pulls information from the back end, and then renders a desktop application. But see, I didn't have to create a separate server, a separate API for each instance, because all my backend does is send the data. So each of these can send data. And this is what we start referring to as microservices. Instead of creating one giant application, you're creating lots of mini applications. Okay, lots of little mini applications. And here's the thing, you don't need to just have one backend. So maybe I have a backend for one feature. Like if I have one backend server that serves one feature set. Okay, so let's say this one handles photos. Okay, so this is my Photos API. So I have a completely separate server, because that way it's not, no one server is processing too many requests. So then I have another one for handling videos. So this is another backend application separately hosted that handles videos. But here's the thing, I want to make sure that you're logged in. So whether you're on mobile, web, or desktop, I want to make sure you're logged in when you access my Photos API and my Videos API. So, Control Z. Control Z. Okay, so then maybe I create another backend API for authorization. Okay, so this is my auth API. So essentially, when you log into either of these front ends, they first go to the auth API, check if you logged in successfully, which sends back what's called a JWT token. So now your front end application has this token that represents that you being logged in, which they can then send to access. Think of it as like a little think of it as like having an ID. Okay, an ID for a particular company's building. Now you can enter the company's building because you have the ID. You can swipe that says, "Hey, you're allowed to go in this building." But before you go there, you have to go to the department, that little office where the security people, they take your picture and they verify that you work at the company, and then give you your ID. That's this auth API. So then they check in with the auth API, they get the token, the ID, sent back to them, and then they can then start sending requests to photos and videos, long as they show their token. Okay, and that's the beauty of this. So with JWT tokens, you don't need to have one API that stores all this information, because with JWT tokens, you just pass your token to the front end, and you can have your entire application across many different back-end applications. So see, this could all be one big, from the user's perspective, they're just logging on to Google and using Google Sheets and Google Docs and using all this stuff, but really it breaks into all these different separate applications. This is what's referred to as microservice architecture, where every piece is where you're taking the whole and building it as several independent pieces that can work together, but they don't need each other. Okay, this backend API never talks to photos or videos. Okay, and nor does it care. All it cares is that people come in, say, "Hey, I want to know if I'm logged in," and it does that, and that's it. That's all it does. So it doesn't care. And then these front ends never talks to the desktop front end, but they don't care. They have nothing to do with each other. All these front ends care about is their ability to speak to the different back end servers, and all these back end servers, all they really care about is their ability to send information to these front end applications. So you have a bunch of different applications in small chunks, and that's referred to as microservices. But the idea is that they're all independent. They don't connect. There's no they're not aware of each other. Okay, how one's just either receiving information and they're all just sending information and not caring really what happens to it. Okay, that's the other application who receives the information that cares what happens to it. Okay, so let's say I create a new photo. On my web application, it just sends the photo over to the back end. It cares not at all about what happens after that. The back end then gets the information and does whatever it has to do with it, and then maybe sends back other information, and that's the information that this front end cares about. So all they're doing is sending information back and forth is the point. Okay, you're no longer having this big app that's connected, that's intrinsically built as one giant app. It's lots of little applications. So basically this backend application could be done in PHP, in Ruby, in Node. You could use multiple languages, who knows? Maybe my auth is in JavaScript, but then my photos API is done in PHP. It doesn't matter because they're just communicating through JSON. So what language one side is written on really doesn't matter, as long as they're just sending the same type of data back and forth, which is JSON. Okay, JSON is the glue. Okay, and it's not really a glue, it's more just like a standard language that all these little islands can speak to each other in. Okay, and that's essentially modern app development. Okay, so modern apps are built in this manner. Okay, so remember, your front end is an application in itself. Your back end is an application in itself. They may communicate, but again, that's not the only front end your API can communicate with. You can have as many front ends communicate with that API as possible. Okay, and that front end can communicate with multiple APIs. It might go pull data from a Google API and the Spotify API, and it's still just one front end application. Everything is sort of portable. It's all just about how information moves around. Okay, cool. So, my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.